And I'd like to introduce Tom Pye, who's a legal human research fellow at UCL, and who's going to give a paper today on the endurance of entail, feudal law, political economy, and land reform, late 18th century Britain. I don't know if you'd like me to give your book a plug.
No. It's not quite written yet. But I mean, I've got to finish it first.
Oh, I see, okay.
And then
Next time
maybe I
maybe
can
then.
plug it. It feels a bit premature.
Oh, well, it's in the
To
pipeline.
plug yet, but hopefully I will be plugging it relatively soon.
Oh, and just one last thing. Afterwards, we do go for supper. I forgot that bit. So anybody who would like to come and hasn't put their name down,
Could I
yes,
jump in at that
you
point?
could jump.
There are 3 spaces available for supper afterwards, and you're up to 3 people. You are very welcome to come. And if I have a show of hands, people who would like to do that, one who might not have registered. Well, you're there.
I'm not registered. I never know.
Okay, that's perfect. Great.
Am I on the list, Tim? Because I think I didn't register.
Yes, I think you are.
Helen normally just puts me
Yeah,
on.
I emailed her.
Yeah, no,
but
I'm-
didn't get a reply.
Okay,
so I
you
don't
are on the
know.
list as well.
Oh,
So that's
right,
fine.
okay.
So there are, I think, 2 more spaces if anybody wants. And that's it. I will.
Okay, off we go, Tom.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you to the community for inviting me in as a regular attender at seminars. Good to be here, give you a paper. So what I'm going to do today is try and rethink this piece of legislation, which is the Entail Improvement Act of 1770. It's also known as the Montgomery Act, named after the Lord Advocate and MP for Peeblesshire, James Montgomery, who carried it through Parliament, and Montgomery will pop up again a bit later. Its subject is the entail, which was a type of feudal land grant that insulated property from the market. What I want to try and show is that the Act's intellectual and political genesis unsettles some of our assumptions about unionism, political economy, and the development of capitalism in Britain. But before kind of getting into what the paper's going to look like, I should give a quick history of the pre-18th century entail, for those of you who aren't familiar with what it actually is. So bear with me while I do that. By the first half of the 13th century, entails were common in England. In 1285, the grant was authorised by the Statute de Donis, which will pop up again a bit later. The Scottish entail or tailsy took root by the early 14th century, and so did similar types of land grants across Western Europe. In the Atlantic world, settlers used the grant, both the land they expropriated and the people they enslaved. And they did so because the entail allowed landholders to prevent their heirs from breaking up, selling off, leasing, or mortgaging their estates. Its lure was well described by the Ayrshire novelist and settler John Galt. The entail begins with its protagonist's resolution to entail his land so that none of his descendants might ever have it in their power to commit the imprudence which had brought his grandfather to a morsel. More famously, an entail drives the plot of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. So if you've ever read the book or seen the show, you've come across an entail. And I'd be very happy to talk about the politics of the entail in Pride and Prejudice in the discussion, because there's quite a lot there. So when it came to British entails, not all entails were created equal, but they were initially similar in England and Scotland. So deed of entail generally works by using some of the wording you can see on this slide. Entails could in theory determine the succession of an estate for all future generations, which is why entails are often referred to as perpetuities. This kind of deed ensured that the heir to the estate couldn't sell or alienate it, as doing so would divert it away from the original line of heirs specified in the original deed. And the heir, or tenant entail, was also prevented from using the estate as collateral for obtaining credit, as mortgaging again could divert the estate to a set of creditors or people not named in the original deed. The issuance of long leases, which will pop up later, was also restricted. If an heir wanted to break their entail, they could procure a private act of parliament. And this was the same initially in Scotland as in England. So those are the initial similarities between the English fee tail and the Scottish tailsy. But in the late 15th century, Scotland and England began to diverge. It was then that the English feudal became breakable by means of a common recovery, which was a judicial process that could be procured from the Court of Common Pleas. Henry VII then legislated in 1487 to allow entails to be barred through another judicial process, fine. In the 16th and 17th century, English judicial decisions then established that the feudal could no longer be perpetual. But in Scotland, the courts never developed a means for breaking them. Case law didn't develop principles to cut short their duration. So in 1685, 400 years after Daydonis, the Scottish Parliament authorised entails. The Treaty of Union in 1707 then preserved Scots common law, protected its courts. So this meant that a Scot wishing to break an entail in the 1750s and 60s by a private act, the Westminster Parliament, but their own courts, the Court of Session in particular, wouldn't help them. So that brings us up to the Entail Improvement Act, 1770. They allowed the holders of tailseed estates to grant leases of a named tenant's life plus 14 years, the lives of two named tenants, 31 years. The Act also allowed landowners to secure small loans against their estates, but it left the basic scaffold of the tailseed untouched. It was still possible to use a deed of entail to specify a line of succession of infinite duration, and it was still impossible to break a deed of tailseed through the Scottish courts. Scots remained unable to break tailseeds through their own courts until the Rutherford Act of 1848. And tailseeds were eventually eradicated in Scotland by the Abolition of Feudal Tenures Act in 2000. So very recently, and you can see some of the amazing language in which the case was made on this slide, and this is from 1999. This is what's being written in 1999. So in England, you haven't been able to make new entails since 1997, but they still exist today. They no longer exist in Scotland, they still exist in England. And if you speak to a barrister who works in property law, they're dealing with entails constantly. Now, what's interesting about the 1770 Act is the economic context of the clearances. Between about 1760 and 1830, Scotland's landowning class brutally transformed its agricultural economy. Scots law favoured the landed interest even more than English common law. And the key example is enclosure. Unlike their English counterparts, Scottish landowners had no need for private parliamentary legislation to enclose lands farmed on the communal one-rig system. They used this permissive regime to initiate a cycle of estate consolidation, tenant dispossession, and rural depopulation in the late 17th century. But the process intensified in the 1760s, when landowners dispossessed tenants and cotters along the upland fringes of the lowlands to make way for large-scale cattle ranching and sheep farming. These lowland clearances were imitated with greater ferocity in the Highlands and Islands in the 19th century. That's the more famous phase of clearances. Landowners forced tenants and cotters from multi-tenant farms into individual holdings, crofts, designed to yield too little income to cover rent. This forced crofters into labouring for the landowners in industries such as kelping, fishing. The real wages were kept low because all-powerful landowners could offset wage rises by increasing rent. Emigration was the consequence, whether to metropolitan urban centres, to the colonies, to the independent United States. Thanks, Jim. The master of the owl. Nice.
It's better before,
It's better before.
yeah. Can you talk, Tom?
Hello.
There we
Talking.
go.
There we go. All right. So the question I'm interested in answering is how the Entail Improvement Act fits into all this. Or to put it another way, how tailseed reform should be related to the emergence of capitalist agriculture in late 18th century Scotland. So the orthodox way of reading the Act is as a grubby compromise between the ideals of improvement and landed power, or feudalism. And this was the line taken by Eric Hobsbawm in an influential essay he wrote in 1980. For him, Scotland's agricultural improvers wanted to eradicate feudal property relations by, quote, turning land into a commodity. The Act was a compromise because it allowed landowners to continue using the entail to shield their estates from capital. The transformation of land into property that could be used as collateral for borrowing continues to be seen as central to the growth of capitalism in the British Atlantic world. You can see two recent examples of this kind of claim on the slide. And the latter is an evolution of the new institution in economics, North Weingast. For Geoffrey Hodgson, the economic problem with pre-modern property rights in England was not that they were insecure. The problem was that they were feudal, meaning that land couldn't be collateralized to finance investment. And this conflict between feudalism and capitalism remains central to our understanding of 18th century Scottish improvement. There remains a consensus that Scottish improvers were anti-feudal because they were unionists. The idea here is that their unionism committed them to English cultural norms, above all the Whig myth that England was modern and post-feudal, not least because its property could be freely bought and sold at market. On this view, Scotland's improver class of jurists, landowners, merchants tried to defeudalise Scotland to bring it into line with England. They believed that the entail dragged on the commercialisation of Scotland's agriculture because it was feudal. Remember that an entailed estate could not be bought and sold. It could only be given and received. So it belonged to the world of the gift, not the market. So by keeping the tailsy unbreakable then, the 1770 Act can be seen as representing the failure of Enlightenment ideals of improvement. So if that's what might be called the orthodox view of tailsy reform, I want to try and propose a different model for understanding it. My claim is that the Act was shaped by a distinctive vision for Scottish development and a distinctive brand of imperial unionism. This strand of Enlightenment Scottish thought was pro-feudal, proposing the compatibility of the feudal law and agricultural improvement. It also reckoned with Scotland's position in Britain's political economy. The landowners and lawyers who adhered to its tenets suggested that in an imperial economy defined by credit and colonial trade, the tailsy made sense. They're thought of as a way of rotating the angle from which we view the Entail Improvement Act. Rather than seeing it as a piecemeal reform that failed to modernise the tailsy, I think we can see it instead as an attempt to give the tailsy new life. So I'll try and make the argument in three parts. First of all, I'll talk about the case against the entail. It was led by the jurist and judge, Lord Keynes, who began to lobby the Westminster Parliament to abolish the tailsy altogether in the 1750s. He professed a wish to bring Scotland into line with a more modern and commercial England. And his was a constitutional vision of development, aimed at redistributing land and the right to vote into a greater number of hands. And second of all, I'll talk about the jurist John Dalrymple, who opposed Keynes's plans from the 1750s onwards. He saw Anglo-Scottish Union as a vehicle for accessing England's colonial markets rather than its constitution. He believed that Scotland's feudal land law was compatible with the development of its agriculture. And he also went further than this, claiming that Scotland's feudal architecture was critical for helping the nation bolster its position within Britain's imperial credit economy. The third section of the paper will track how these rival views of Scottish development played out in the 1760s. In 1764, the Faculty of Advocates, which is the Scottish bar, attempted to effectively abolish a tailsy. Supporters of the plan made the constitutional arguments similar to those of Keynes. Its opponents among the county landowners clung to Dalrymple's views, which were widely published. The faculty's attempt at reform ultimately failed, but Dalrymple's vision for the entail was the basis of the Entail Improvement Act of 1770. So, first of all, to Keynes, who began attacking the tailsy in earnest in 1758, and that's him there. In February that year, he told another lawyer that he'd drawn up a tailsy bill. By August the next year, this is 1759, Keynes had sent a bill to the former Lord Chancellor, Lord Hardwicke, with the declaration that, quote, this country will be ruined by entails if they continue to be supported by the legislature. His bill proposed repealing Scotland's Tailsy Act of 1685, which would prevent any new deeds of entail from being made. And you can see a bit of his bill slide. Entails already made under the authority of the 1685 Act would be phased out. They would continue to be valid for tenants entail and any heirs who were alive at the time the new act was made. But after the death of these tenants and heirs, their estate's tail would be converted into fees simple. Now, fee simple was the most unmitigated interest it was possible to have in land. The owners of fee simple estates would be able to sell them, split them up, mortgage them as they pleased. In other words, they would have what we would now refer to as full ownership. The Bill's preamble set out what Keynes referred to as the public evils of the tailsy. They were focused on the negative consequences of a concentrated distribution of Scottish land. Keynes hung his argument on English Whig history. More specifically, he hung it on the idea that Henry VII's anti-entail legislation had redistributed England's feudal estates to common people in the 16th century, empowering their parliamentary representatives to seize sovereignty in the revolution of 1688-89. And this thesis originated in 17th century English Commonwealthman James Harrington, and more distantly in English philosopher Francis Bacon. The Tory and Jacobite Viscount Bolingbroke referred to the redistribution of feudal land as, quote, the great change of English history. Yet it was also recited in the court Whig press as a social explanation for how the English House of Commons had risen to power over the course of the 17th century. By the time of the Tailsy debate, Harrington's thesis had become a towering monument of England's political culture, as one of the most potent stories the English possessed for organising their history. So Keynes was copying from this Whiggish script when he wrote in the Bill's preamble that, quote, the size of land estates had a great influence on the manners or culture of the people. It was only in constitutions populated by what he called the middle-sized proprietor that the, quote, true spirit of liberty could be found. This kind of landowner lacked the property and therefore the power to render others dependent on them. Constitutions in which land was concentrated in fewer hands, by contrast, were characterised by infighting between nobles and the fear of those who depended on them for their existence. Scotland, Keynes thought, was, quote, evidently tending towards the latter, but Britain was based in the former. Thus it appears, he wrote, that the distribution of land among many proprietors is perfectly agreeable to the genius of the British government, and that nothing is more averse to its genius than the accumulation of land in a few individuals. So the claim here is that entails were keeping Scotland in the feudal condition in which English had languished before what Bolingbroke referred to as its great change. In Keynes's eyes, abolition would remould Scotland's pattern of land ownership into an English shape. I just want to end my bit on Keynes by suggesting that we see his bill as a constitutional model for Scotland's development, rather than simply as a piece of assimilationist ideology. This is because Keynes knew that the bill would take Scots land law further away from English law, rather than bring the two legal systems together. When he received the draft bill from Keynes, Lord Hardwicke pointed this out. And that's what you can see about in this slide. While a new deed of entail could no longer be perpetual in English law, an English entail could still settle land on a succession of people, provided that they were living at the time the deed was made. Between the middle of the 17th and the end of the 19th century, the English landed classes favoured this type of entail. They did so as part of a kind of trust called the strict settlement, which was their preferred way to give land right across this period. So when Keynes wrote the bill in 1759, the entail was widespread in England. On top of this, no English statute or judicial decision had ever retrospectively interfered with the entail law. So Keynes's bill was quite radical. By phasing out existing entails retrospectively and preventing their creation in the future, it went well beyond the aim of Anglicising Scottish law. If England was the model of a legal system adapted to, quote, the needs of commerce, and Keynes's bill ignored it. So I want to suggest instead that Keynes was driven by the conviction that Scottish land ownership was too concentrated and had to be redistributed in order to broaden the franchise. Scottish law had helped Scottish land to stay in the wrong hands, and Keynes wanted Parliament to intervene to channel it into the right ones. This would expropriate a form of Scottish property protected by the Treaty of Union. But only then could Scottish agriculture improve, led by the many proprietors of the English constitutional model. So that's Keynes's vision of the development. And by the time Keynes had sent his bill to Lord Hardwicke in 1758, John Dalrymple published an original new history of landholding in Britain. We're now into the second bit of the paper. To make his case for land reform, Keynes had drawn on the ubiquitous Whig idea that the genius of the British Constitution lay in its broad distribution of land, which is obviously nonsense. But Dalrymple defended the unequal distribution of land property, created by the feudal system. You can see from the title page here that we're beginning to get a different story to the one told by Keynes. If Harrington is the presiding intellectual spirit behind Keynes's agitation for entail reform, then Montesquieu is lurking behind Dalrymple. But Dalrymple's debts went deeper than quoting the jurist and former judge of Bordeaux Civil Court on his title page. When he sent a copy to Charles Yorke, son of Lord Hardwicke and at the time Solicitor General, he claimed that he'd had the honour of some assistance from President Montesquieu. In the essay's preface, he claimed that Montesquieu revised the work himself. There's nowhere verifying this. So. Keynes had used the 17th century English antiquarians, Henry Spelman and Robert Brady, to date the introduction of the feudal law to William the Conqueror in England and Malcolm Campbell. Keynes had also used Spelman to claim that feudal tenures placed the, quote, whole land property of England and Scotland into the hands of these two kings and their chief men. So for Keynes, the feudal system was a distributive problem. But Dalrymple argued instead that feudal tenures arrived with the Saxons in the 5th century, the same time that the Franks had arrived into Roman Gaul. His account of their introduction drew heavily from Montesquieu. He claimed that the Saxons had, quote, never assumed the property of the whole land to themselves. Instead, they created a patchwork of land ownership and jurisdiction, allowing many of the existing inhabitants to keep their land. And you can see part of the story he tells on the slide. This vision of feudal history was distinctive, and Dalrymple used it to reimagine Scotland's tailseed estates as a cog in the machinery of Britain's modern economy. Like Keynes, he acknowledged the gulf between the English and Scottish law of entail. But Dalrymple didn't believe that the gap needed to be forcibly closed by British legislation. Where Keynes denounced the blindness of the Scottish Statute of 1685, so this is the law that authorised entails in Scotland, Dalrymple explained that its intention was to protect the credit market. It may have given the imprimatur of statute to the practice of entailing states, but it also prevented creditors from being ensnared by devious tenants and tail. By stipulating that tailseeds had to be approved by the Court of Session and entered into a new public register of tailseeds, the Act helped lenders to understand why the landowners were restricted by tailseeds. If landowners failed to enter their tailseeds into the register, they would no longer be protected by the Court of Session. Their debts would be upheld for creditors who had contracted with them in good faith. The most significant of Dalrymple's objections to abolition was that a liquid Scottish land market would not benefit British commerce. Dalrymple suggested that it was preferable to maintain an illiquid land market characterised by low supply and high prices. Low supply diverted the middling ranks into manufacturing and trade rather than landlordism, and high prices made it difficult for merchants to, quote, convert their circulating cash into a dead stock of land. Releasing huge tracts of Scottish land into the British land market, in Dalrymple's view, would increase supply and lower prices, encouraging Scottish merchants to become, quote, little lairds, poor, proud, and idle. Tailsy abolition was the same as diverting, quote, money out of trade to the purchase of land. Now, Dalrymple acknowledged the problem of breakability, and the idea that they're breakable in England and not in Scotland. But he pointed out that there was already flexibility in the system. Private acts of parliament, he wrote, are, quote, constantly granted to break entails. And in this, he was right. Between 1660 and 1800, estate acts comprised 17% of the legislation made by the Westminster Parliament. a rate of around 20 to 40 per parliamentary session. For English landowners, they were easier, quicker, and cheaper than a decision from the court chancery. The largest Scottish landowners were able to absorb their costs with ease. So for Dalrymple, tailsies were already breakable through Parliament, and their abolition would only hurt British commerce. He was comfortable with their feudal origin, and he was unconcerned with the concentrated pattern of landholding that they created. His key claim was that the current tailsy law enabled the, quote, old families to preserve themselves in their estates, and while they share the wealth, the liberty, and the safety of the English, feel their ancient lustre the same. You can see the full claim on the slide. So to quickly recap where we are, Keynes wanted to draw down the power of Britain's expropriative state to transfer land into the hands of smaller landowners. He saw land through the prism of the Constitution as a means of accessing the franchise. He was animated by the problem of distribution. But Dalrymple was uninterested in spreading land ownership more widely among the Scottish population. He saw the tailsy as a way of allocating capital more efficiently within Britain's commercial system. In his terms, the feudal law was neither pre-modern nor pre-commercial. Scotland's pattern of land ownership, battened down by its feudal law, was a spur to British trade. Now, so far I've been talking about works of jurisprudence and private correspondence from the 1750s. But the tailsy debate came to a head after the conclusion of the 7 Years' War. We're now into the final part of the paper. In June 1764, Alexander Lockhart tasked a committee of Scots lawyers with investigating the tailsy. Lockhart was then dean of the Faculty of Advocates, again, the Scottish Bar. He was clear about his intentions. He told the group that entails would, quote, overwhelm the whole nation by withdrawing the bulk of Scotland's land from the market. He then asked them to resolve the issue. After Lockhart's push, the committee moved fast. A month later, they drew up a bill for the effective abolition of the tailsy. And that's what you can see on this slide. In March the following year, at a meeting chaired by James Montgomery, they decided to send it out to the counties and royal boroughs for consultation. In April, the faculty published a bill as a pamphlet that was reproduced in its entirety in the Scots magazines. It's one of the most widely read papers. That's what you can see on the slide. Unlike Keynes's bill, the Advocates' bill did not propose total abolition, but they did propose a few changes. Their bill limited tailsies to people who were living at the time the deed was made. It allowed the provision of longer leases and rental income for spouses and younger children who would never inherit the estate, and its effect was retroactive, applying to both existing and future tailsies. Now, the bill produced an intense pamphlet debate, and Dalrymple was quickest off the mark. So the pamphlet you can see on this slide made two key interventions. The first was to shatter the vision of English history that Keynes's abolitionism relied upon. The second was to reimagine the feudal tailsy as a critical part of Britain's modern imperial economy. Keynes had argued that England had broken the hold of its entails in the 15th century, creating a free market in land and redistributing it, as Keynes put it, among many proprietors. But Dalrymple dismissed this story as an illusion. There were few countries in Europe where the transition of land property is less easy and free than in England, he claimed. He estimated that the strict settlement hived off about 50% of English land from the market, whereas the tailsy restricted only 20% of Scotland's. This meant that half of English land was held in trusts that forbid its owners from securing loans against their estates. But Dalrymple pointed out that the English never, quote, cry out that the hands of trade are tied up and disabled. English common law also protected land property from seizure by creditors in all sorts of ways. And Dalrymple claimed that this amounted to, quote, an entail of all the lands of England. So Dalrymple saw the propertied Englishman hadn't disappeared in the 18th century. He had merely begun to lock up his land with the strict settlement rather than the perpetual entail. For Dalrymple, England's wealth hadn't derived from an upstart middling class of improver freeholders. England had increased its wealth instead through foreign trade, which for Dalrymple meant exporting more than it imported. The demand for English and now British manufactures was provided by the colonies. Dalrymple described the empire engorged by the Treaty of Paris in 1763 as a, quote, vast then and progressive in its vastness. The task for policy was to orientate supply to match colonial demand. To facilitate investment in manufacturing for colonial markets, Dalrymple claimed that the price of land had to be high and the price of money or interest rates had to be low. Releasing land into the market by abolishing entails would have the opposite effect. It would suppress the price of land while increasing interest rates. By allowing Scottish landowners to dissipate their fortunes on luxury goods, it would also increase the demand for what Dalrymple referred to as home consumption. For the Scots to take advantage of the imperial privileges that they'd won in 1707, it was imperative, he thought, to keep their entails. For Dalrymple, keeping Scotland's feudal land law would give new life to Britain's modern imperial economy. Talesy law only needed loosening to allow longer leases and provisions for spouses and younger children. You can see a bit of this on the slide. So Dalrymple soon found support from Patrick Murray, Lord Elibank, another advocate. Elibank said that he used the chant "down with entails," but he said that Dalrymple converted him into an evangelist with Talesy. Like Dalrymple, he suggested that it was ridiculous to see England as being marked by a more equal distribution of property and a free market in land. In England, he pointed out, every estate is entailed, of course, by a marriage settlement, and that's what I've been referring to as a strict settlement. And like Dalrymple, he saw the Talesy as critical to protecting Scotland's position within the British imperial economy. Elibank conjured up the spectre of Scotland being flooded by English capital. He claimed that the faculty's bill would open up the Scottish land market to English buyers, who would soon become absentee landlords. Scotland would then be turned into a British colony, modelled on Ireland and the West Indies. These were colonies which Elibank described as, quote, rich in themselves, but beggared by the absentees spending their rents in England. The pamphlet debate, though, didn't all go Dalrymple's way. Another advocate, John Swinton, defended the bill. Like Dalrymple, that's the pamphlet he wrote, that's it. Like Dalrymple, Swinton was an advocate and a member of the entails subcommittee. So this is a subcommittee that was tasked with solving the problem. But he resurrected James's case. For Swinton, the problem with the Talesy was its effect on the distribution of land. He claimed that the, quote, true strength and real support of liberty were the, quote, middling gentry and the proprietors of small portions of land. And English history, to him, proved the point. Swinton described Henry VII's anti-entail legislation as, quote, a law for the division of lands. By allowing entails to be broken by fines, the first Tudor monarch could, quote, cut the root of that unconstitutional power by which the barons had so much disturbed the peace of its kingdom. Swinton dated what he referred to as the era of English liberty and of English riches to this redistributive moment, and questioned why the Scots should choose to, quote, fix upon our own necks a yoke that the English had already thrown off. The post-rebellion legislation that destroyed heritable jurisdictions, and this is part of a kind of package of legislation that the British Parliament passed in the wake of the Jacobite Rebellion of 45, ensured Swinton that unconstitutional powers had received a great blow in Scotland. But Swinton left his readers with the claim that entailed estates had survived the British onslaught and continued to have, quote, an unconstitutional influence on parliamentary elections. So from May 1765, responses from counties and boroughs began to roll in and into the pages of Scotland's largest newspapers and periodicals. Now you can see on this slide which counties rode in behind the faculty's bill. Many have some of the highest concentrations of land and wealth in Scotland. Selkirk, Nairn, West Lothian, Dumfries and Orkney all fit that bill. So these are some of the most concentrated patterns of land ownership in Scotland. But support wasn't unanimous. Some boroughs and counties published vague resolutions in favour of amending the Talesy law rather than full-throated support for the faculty's bill. In August, the Stewardship of Galloway, County of Perth, and the Society of Writers to the Signet did so. Others went further by rejecting the faculty's bill altogether and proposing that entails could be limited by rental values instead. East Lothian, Peebles, Clackmannan, and Stirling each fall into this category. Now, what's striking, I think, about the opposition to the faculty's bill was that it didn't issue from the areas with the greatest concentration of land wealth. East Lothian is the only exception, with only the border county of Roxburgh having a higher concentration of land ownership across all of Scotland. The central counties of Clackmannan and Stirling had some of the least concentrated patterns of land ownership in Scotland, while the greater landowners of Peebles, Fife, Perth, and Galloway had a far looser grip than those in many of the counties that had supported the faculty. The Borders county of Dumfries and the Highland counties of Murray and Orkney were especially notable counties to support the effective abolition of the Talesy, with the largest landowners controlling over 65, 57, 54% of their rental value, respectively. Not all counties responded before the faculty sent the bill to Westminster in 1765. Dalrymple himself tried to delay it at every meeting he could, but he needn't have worried because the bill met a quick death in Westminster. But its failure didn't mark the end of Talesy reform. It was picked up 2 years later by the Duke of Buccleuch, whose estate stretched the length of the Scottish border, so one of the biggest landowners in Scotland. Buccleuch began to pay the political economist Adam Smith a pension of £300 a year in 1767. The same year, Buccleuch had contracted Alexander Lockhart, so he's the guy who set up the committee to investigate entails, for a legal opinion on the various Talesyes by which his estates were held. He recommended a private act of parliament to loosen Buccleuch's Talesyes, and Smith helped to draw up the act. As well as being private, relating only to Buccleuch's estates, Smith's draft act also centred on Dalrymple's prescription for longer leases. Unlike the faculty's bill, it didn't interfere with the duration of his Talesyes. This more moderate form was palatable enough to the Westminster law lords that they recommended a more general application for Scotland. The result was the Entail Improvement Act of 1770. So the act reformed the entail along the lines that Dalrymple had advocated. As he had wished, the act left the basic scaffold of the Talesy untouched. As Montgomery explained to the Duke of Buccleuch, quote, "The object of the law is the improvement of the entailed estate. The existence of entails was taken as a given. The object of law, in the eyes of the lawyer and MP who carried it through Parliament, this Montgomery, was not to sound the death knell for Talesyes. It was to put them on a more stable footing." From 1770 onwards, the entail only became more popular as a means of gifting land. Over 2/3 of the entails recorded in the Register of Talesyes by 1830 were recorded after 1760. Yet contrary to what Keynes had suggested, the proliferation of the Talesy didn't come at the cost of a contraction of credit. In November 1769, the Heir Bank of Douglas, Heron and Company was set up. It was effectively a land bank, backed by the estates of some of Scotland's largest landowners. The Duke of Queensberry, who was also governor of the British Linen Company, which is another Scottish bank. The third Duke of Buccleuch, we've already heard about, and the Earls of Dumfries, March and Ruglen, and also Archibald Douglas, first Baron Douglas. Because most of the estates of these landowners were Talesyed, the bank's capital was not explicitly tied to land through mortgage contracts, which was how land banks in the American colonies tended to function. The security provided by the landowners' estates, the value of which has been estimated about £3 to £4 million total, was implicit. Their promissory notes and bills of exchange were accepted and circulated by British merchants because their partners were subject to unlimited liability in the event of bankruptcy. It was widely believed that the Duke of Queensberry alone was capable of paying the bank's liabilities as they stood in 1772. In June that year, the Ayr Bank was one of 14 Scottish banks to fail due to a contraction of credit across the United Kingdom. The pan-British credit crisis of 1772 exposed the degree to which the Ayr Bank had been drawing bills of exchange on corresponding banks in London in order to pay its own liabilities, and that's the process you can see depicted in the cartoon. At the point of its failure, Adam Smith estimated that £600,000 of these bills were outstanding. Over half of the bank's 237 shareholders were landowners. The biggest flexed their muscles to avoid a bankruptcy and avoided unlimited liability. In 1774, Buccleuch and Queensberry contracted James Montgomery again, to procure an act of parliament that would allow them to convert the bank's liabilities into bonds secured by mortgages on some of their unentailed estates. And in doing so, they avoided the exposure of unlimited liability, even as half the bank's less powerful stockholders became insolvent. So their tailsies never prevented them from capitalizing a land bank, but their tailsies did protect their capital after the bank's failure. So that's the tailsy debate of the 50s and 60s. On one side of the debate, jurists like Keynes and Swinton believed that the key to England's commercial success was constitutional. They bought into the Whiggish idea that England had managed to shed its feudal past by redistributing its land to a new middling class, forging a new kind of parliamentary monarchy. This was why Keynes claimed that the genius of the British Constitution lay in its distribution of land among, quote, many proprietors. It was also why Swinton dated the era of English riches, and not just of English liberty, to the reign of Henry VII. In their eyes, the modern world was the world of the small landowner. And as a result, their visions for Scottish development were based around redistribution. It's due to the prominence of jurists like Keynes, I think, that social and economic historians have always raised their eyebrows at the apparently anti-feudal bent of Scotland's 18th century intellectual culture. So the work of historians like Tom Devine, and more recently Andrew MacKillop, has always been clear that the improvement of Scottish agriculture always empowered and entrenched its landowning class. So they've questioned, rightly I think, why jurists like Keynes serenaded the plucky English freeholder, scorned the feudal law, and bound improvement so clearly to redistribution. What I'm trying to show is that this wasn't the only vision of development for Scotland. On the other side of the tailsy debate, jurists like Dalrymple and Elibank rejected the idea that England had shed its feudal past. They claimed that the Whig history of land ownership in England was an illusion, and that less land was marketable in England than in Scotland. For them, England's wealth depended on metabolizing colonial demand, rather than aristocratic land. This was why they both suggested that liquid land markets were immaterial to profiting from Britain's colonies. For them, land redistribution wasn't a necessity, but a risk. Opening up Scotland's land markets to English capital could turn it from a metropolitan province into a colony. The winding up of the Ayr Bank shows just how useful tailsy could be for shielding Scottish capital from English creditors. Scottish landowners weren't the only people in the British Empire to see its commercial uses. To specifically encourage agricultural improvement, the Virginia legislature enacted a statute in 1727 that permitted enslaved people to be entailed. Across Britain's West Indian and American colonies more broadly, landowners used the entail to shield themselves from the financial demands of metropolitan creditors. I just want to finish up by trying to zoom out a bit and think through some of the implications of all this. I think perhaps because of the influence of English Marxist historians from the 1950s onwards, were accustomed to seeing feudalism and capitalism as stages in the sequence of development or modernization. The debates these historians spawned focused on explaining the mechanisms of this transition in Europe. They turned on the question of whether Mediterranean trade dissolved feudal property relations, whether the increasing exploitation of surplus peasant labour by landlords offered a better explanation. And these debates have since been flushed through the categories of gender and race. Recent work by legal historians like Claire Priest and Katerina Pistol has muddied the clarity of the concept of transition even further. Pistol in particular has argued powerfully that the law is what turns things like land into capital, and that many of the laws we use today to turn things into capital are feudal in origin. If capital, as she argues, is a quote, legal quality that helps create and protect wealth, then the entail is a tool to give capital durability. By protecting land from the fluctuations of the market and the hands of creditors, the entail turned land into durable capital. Now that land is no longer the primary source of wealth in industrialized economies, the legal fiction of the corporation serves the function of the entail. She's very clear that the corporation originated in the law of entail. The feudal calculus, as she puts it, is alive, kicking. So I think using this historiography to rewrite the history of the entail helps to shed some new light on British legal history. The persistence of the feudal legal system in 18th and 19th century Scotland is often viewed as an unusual hangover, especially when compared to England. It's easy to assume, I think, that the feudal law was a drag on capitalism, and the Scottish agriculture and Scottish industry developed despite its feudal landlord. But in the 18th century, it was by no means clear the legal remnants of British feudalism had to be abolished to make way for improvement. And in Scotland, you might have expected opposition to talesy reform to come from the largest landowners, with the smaller eager for abolition. But this isn't what happened. Clackmannan, Stirling, to a lesser extent Peeblesshire, Fife, Perth, Galloway, had some of the least concentrated patterns of land ownership in late 18th century Scotland. For the freeholders of these counties, it made sense to opt for the feudal land law. They saw little conflict between the feudal entail and capitalist improvement. They might have even seen them as symbiotic. So I'll just close with the case of James Montgomery, a landowner who believed in the entail's endurance. He's the lawyer after whom the Entail Improvement Act is commonly named, and he's cropped up a bit in the paper. He fits the profile of an improver. He was an active member of the Board of Trustees for the encouragement of arts, manufactures and commerce in Scotland. He was the first Sheriff Deputy of Peeblesshire, one of the counties that opposed the faculty's bill, and later sat as the county's MP. He was Lord Advocate between 1766 and 75. He was also convinced of both the commercial benefits of heritable property and the utility of feudal law for generating capital that was durable. In 1768, he was granted 20,000 acres of land on Prince Edward Island in Canada. And that's the grant you can see on the slide. He soon quadrupled the size of his estate, this is the Canadian estate, and governed it as an absentee landlord until his death, leasing land to Highland settlers. In 1790 and 1798, and that's what you can see on the left-hand side, he entailed his own estates, Scotland. Because of the existence of the Register for Talesies, which we can talk about a bit more in discussion, we have far better land records for Scotland than we do for England. And because of the concurrent endurance of the entail, as part of the English strict settlement, Montgomery's story was replicated all over Britain. I'll leave it there.